locally and shared with the world.
Thank you so much. I am Bill Crakel. I'm president of Aspetuck Land Trust. And I'm happy to have you all here tonight. This is terrific. We are going to experience our Haskins lecture, our annual Haskins lecture, and Leila Philip is going to be the speaker, and she's the author of Beaverland, and David will give you a more complete introduction in a moment. I want to make a couple of acknowledgments just to start, and the first acknowledgement I want to make is to Carl and Ed Haskins, who've endowed the lecture that you're hearing here tonight. For those of you who don't know, Carl and Edna were longtime Westport residents who were scientists, educators, and entrepreneurs, a very interesting combination of skills. And they were wise enough to leave their estate, 22 acres on Great Acre Lane, to us, back in 1980, and they endowed the property so that it would be perpetually maintained, and they gave us money for educational things like this. And they were people who cared a lot about the future of our ecology, as are our members. And we are here tonight also to acknowledge our members who support us in everything that we do. And we are doing a lot these days, and a few things I just want to mention to you that I mention every time I get the chance. One is preservation and conservation of land. And most of you know that is our primary reason for being. And since 2020, since we began our Green Corridor campaign, we have preserved 187 acres. We have 120 acres under contract right now, and we're chasing another 63 in the pipeline, as David says. So we are continuing, with your support, our land acquisition and preservation efforts. Second thing I want to mention is the Green Corridor campaign, which also began in 2020 in the midst of COVID. And Mary Ellen LeMay has done a wonderful job with that. And it's a simple concept. Plant natives, rethink your lawn, and reduce or eliminate pesticides and herbicides. And we think that it's caught on. Thousands of people have taken our Green Corridor pledge, and it's spreading. And what we're seeing is backyard biodiversity that promotes wildlife, here in Fairfield County. And we hope to make a patchwork quilt of places that show biodiversity. It should be fun. And the last thing I want to mention is our nascent effort in Bridgeport. And we have done a lot of outreach through our Building Bridges program, and we've brought many people from Bridgeport to our properties. But we were graced with a grant from the state of Connecticut in the spring to bring the forest to Bridgeport. And we have started planting 7 microforests adjacent to schools that are going to be used as demonstration projects for school children, which is wonderful. And we're actually going to get to measure the impact of those forests on the surrounding communities. The state has actually granted us funds to see how much it impacts the Bridgeport community, which is terrific. So we can't do this without the support of you, our members, and we're incredibly pleased to have you all here today and for your generosity, and we hope that we can continue to have your support as we go forward, bringing you events like this and doing the good work that we're doing. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. Good to see everybody here. I'm David Brandt, Executive Director of Aspetuck Land Trust. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I'm excited to welcome you and introduce our Haskins Lecture guest speaker, Leila Philip, author of the bestseller Beaverland. I know you join me in offering congratulations to Leila on the success of this wonderful book. We're thrilled she has brought so much attention to one of our favorite animals, what she has rightly called one weird rodent. We love and enjoy the adventures of our own beavers, both in Trout Brook Valley and at our Island Pond Preserve in Easton, and we really appreciate the fresh perspective on the importance of the beaver and the role it plays in our ecosystem. And it's important to remember that these beavers and all the species living on our preserves and open spaces would not be here without active conservation efforts to save the land. And you've probably heard me say this before. I will say it again because I like this phrase. Land does not preserve itself. People preserve land. People like you. And as Bill thanked our members and all of our supporters, we just cannot do this work without our members that care about open space and nature and our planet. And it's very important. And I will reiterate what Bill said. We're incredibly proud that we have saved 187 acres since 2020, another 120 acres under contract, and 68.7 acres in the pipeline. We keep track of all these tenths of an acre. It's not an easy landscape to preserve land in Fairfield County. We are not up in rural New Hampshire. So we're kicking butt, we're saving land. A Guggenheim Fellow, Leila, has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and was a popular columnist at the Boston Globe. Leila currently teaches in the Environmental Studies program at the College of the Holy Cross, where she holds the Brooks Chair in the Humanities as a professor in the English department. Leila Philip first fell in love with beavers when she saw a group of them building in a pond near her home in Woodstock, Connecticut. After 6 years of observation and significant research, Leila wrote Beaverland, a New York Times Editor's Choice, an NPR Science Friday book club selection, and she's appeared to talk about it on CBS Sunday Morning. Her book has been called A Triumph of Nature Writing by Publishers Weekly, quote, a fascinating and lyrical exploration by the Washington Post, full of charm by the Wall Street Journal, and given a loud slap of the tail in approval by author Bill McKibben, who was actually our first Haskins lecture speaker in 2013, and many other positive and glowing reviews. In these challenging times of climate change, with increased flooding, storms, fires, and record temperatures, just turn on the TV, just look outside your window, and connecting to the natural world around us is an important part of finding solutions to heal the landscape. Thanks to Leila, this crucial journey of understanding most definitely includes an appreciation for one weird rodent. Please join me in welcoming Leila Philip.
Thank you so much. That's a really, really wonderful introduction. And I have to say, I'm incredibly honored to be here. It was just exciting to look on the website and learn about all the work you're doing down here. And yes, I am here to speak a word about beavers. And before I go into my talk and really do a deep dive into one of my favorite subjects, I thought I want to just tell you a little bit about how I got into it. I think, Dave, thank you for saying a little bit about how I got started, because I am a writer, a storyteller, and a journalist, not a beaver specialist. Although after 6 years of studying them and watching them and documenting them, I did learn a bit. But I just want to tell you a little bit about how it all got started, because I grew up on a farm in the Hudson Valley, and I think one of the great gifts of growing up on a farm is you're often pretty bored and hot as a kid. And so the pond in the center of this farm was really where we would all end up, the kids, and jump in the stinky hot water, warm water. And I would spend a lot of time following frogs around. And it occurs to me that those frogs, which could be on land with us, but then we would swim around with, were kind of precursors to beavers, because beavers, I think, fascinate us. They certainly fascinate me because we can be with them on the land, but then they go underwater where we really can't follow them. And I certainly discovered beavers by accident one day when I was walking in the woods with my beloved dog, Coda, and I just heard this crack. It sounded like, for a minute, I thought a gun had gone off. And Coda froze, and I followed where she was looking, and sure enough, it was a beaver who had slammed her tail to pretty much tell me to get lost because she was swimming back and forth in front of her newly made dam, which I noticed for the first time. And it's interesting because I had walked by that spot in the woods every day, and I didn't even notice that it had filled with water until I heard the sound, and then, oh my gosh, it was incredible. What had previously been a kind of dry swamp became very quickly a stunning pond, a woodland pond. And I think many of you here have seen this kind of magic transformation in the woods, and that's what I witnessed. And that was the beginning of my interest in beavers, and I set out to learn about them. And what I would learn is very quickly when I started researching it, beavers jump-started transatlantic trade. It was in part lust for beaver fur that got ships sailing across the Atlantic here to find beaver pelts and trade them in Europe, because beaver felt, which could be made from the incredible fur, was needed for the hat industry. By the 1500s, beavers had been pretty much wiped out in Europe because the felt was so valuable. And once it was discovered that beavers could be found in North America, ships came sailing across looking for this incredibly valuable commodity. So by the 19th century, beaver pelts were really jump-starting the engines of capitalism here. And that, of course, is a fascinating story that's been documented. But it isn't just that beavers helped start the first economies of our country. What I would discover, and this is what really fascinated me, was that beavers literally shaped the continent. And to understand this, you have to imagine back to when North America was Beaverland, when literally 400 million beaver were living in every watershed throughout the continent, shaping the river systems that spread water throughout the land, pulsing water, pulsing arteries of life. And in my book, I wanted to share two really important realizations that I made. And one was that when we wiped out beavers, we started what scientists and environmental researchers now identify as the first period of environmental devastation on this continent. They call it the period of the Great Drying. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the second is that in the early 1900s, a concerted effort to bring beavers back that was successful meant that beavers would become one of our greatest conservation success stories. So let's just look a little bit at beavers and talk about the animal itself. Here are two pictures of beavers, and okay, so we can see right away, they may not win an animal beauty contest, but they have these winsome, kind of bear-like faces. They appear to be smiling, they have pear-shaped bodies, and they have this lustrous fur. There's literally as much hair in a postage-size stamp area of a beaver's hide as on a human head. That's something like 126,000 individual strands of hair. So you can get an idea of how thick this pelt actually is. But if you move down, they have these extraordinary hands, which are 5-fingered. They have these very extraordinary sort of human-like hands that can do the feats of engineering that we're going to get to later. And then you move down and they have these kind of crazy duck-like feet, and things get stranger and stranger and end with this paddle tail. Sometimes people ask me, are beavers related to platypuses? Because they sort of seem like they might be. They're actually not, but the paddle tail is, I think, the weirdest and most wonderful feature of the beaver. And you can see it here spread out in the second image where the beaver's swimming. So this paddle tail, it functions as a water sensor, an energy source, and an air conditioning system, and that's just the beginning. So if a dam is breached, if there's a hole in a dam, beavers will immediately go out and fix it. In part, they're responding to the sound of running water. We know that. That's an environmental cue. But they're not just responding to the sound of water. It's actually sensors in their tail. It's actually blood vessels in the tail that help them indicate the water pressure. So they can actually feel when the pressure in the pond has changed, and they will swim right out and fix that dam. So they don't have to see it, they don't have to be near it, they can just feel it, which is pretty extraordinary. The other thing about all those blood vessels that run through the tail is that they cool the beaver down in summer. And so it's their kind of air conditioning system. In the winter, a beaver goes into something called torpor. It's not hibernation, but it's close. They basically slow their metabolic system down, so they need very little oxygen and very little food. And they live off fat stored in their tail. The beaver's tail was a really prized source of food for early fur trappers and explorers because it was this luscious bit of fat. And in fact, in medieval times, it was also a prized delicacy because the Catholic Church had this little sort of special ruling that you could eat beaver on Friday because since it was so close to fish, it was considered like a fish. So you could have a beaver tail instead of your fish on Friday. But so the beaver tail will actually, beavers will live off the fat in their tail through the winter. So from a historical standpoint, beavers have lived in the United States and Canada throughout North America for millennia. And in the Pleistocene, they were as big as bears, which I love thinking about, although some people have said, isn't that a little scary? Maybe. But they did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to creating the rich, diverse, and healthy ecosystem. And that's what we should talk about. But before, I want to just talk about some of the misconceptions of beavers, because beavers have fascinated the human imagination for centuries. And I think in part it's because we really can't follow them where they live. And if we go back in time to the 13th century, in the Aberdeen bestiary, you can find images of beavers depicted, you can see there as blue. They have long tails, they look kind of serpentine. In the 13th century, beavers were highly prized as a source of medicine because beaver castor, they have internal glands that are the castor glands, was a kind of cure-all from everything from headaches to insanity could be cured by a little bit of castor. 15th century, you can see beavers were depicted often a little bit more like alligators with tails. Again, the animal itself was really not understood, except it was understood that they ate trees and bushes. And then the 16th century, I love this one. It looks a little bit like a bobcat or a squirrel, maybe. So the list of wonderful images of beavers goes on. But let's turn to some science, and let's look at why beavers are being valued today and re-examined today for the new role that they are playing as nature-based restoration partners, because they're being utilized throughout the country in really interesting and important ways. So they've been given the moniker ecosystem engineers because they are literally the only animal apart from man, or humans, I should say, that creates the environment that they need to survive. And they need water, lucky for us, because water is certainly the story of our century, whether it's too much water from extreme storms causing loss of life, or too little water causing drought and wildfire, coastlines being erased by rising seas. It's all about water right now and our problems managing it. And beavers do exactly that. So how do they do this? Well, the largest animal construction on the earth is actually a beaver dam. And I think many of you here have seen beaver dams here in the east. Maybe you've been out west where they often are much, much larger. This picture on the left is actually the beaver dam that I watched being built right near my house this past December. The largest beaver dam that we know of in North America is 2,790 feet long, which is pretty long. That's quite a bit longer than the Hoover Dam, if you think about it. It's up in northern Alberta. And the other thing about what beavers do is that they will go to a stream or a creek, and they will build not just one dam, but they'll build a series of dams. And they do this for a number of reasons. And you can see in the slide on the right that they've built a series of dams here. This is an image from Wyoming that Dr. Emily Fairfax lent to me. So what you see is by building a series of dams in a row, the water is not only held and creates a small pond, like a ponding effect, but it moves laterally and creates a great deal of connection between land and water. And that lower pond supports the upper pond. So this is really significant. It's pretty sophisticated engineering, actually, because each dam supports the dam above it. And in fact, one of the researchers that I write about in the book, Dr. Jordan Kennedy, who was actually working at Harvard when I interviewed her as part of a very sophisticated engineering lab, said she thought that we could learn a lot about flood control if we studied the way beavers built dams, because they built dams that were incredibly resilient to extreme flood events. Humans tend to build one big dam and expect that one big dam to hold it all. But beavers will build dams in a series like this, and then they'll build side canals to also pick up some of the shear force of the water. So it's interesting, there's a lot of biomimicry or engineering patterned on nature that's beginning to happen based on beaver constructions. But basically you can see from these images that what beavers do is they slow water down. And once the water is slowed down in the river system, it creates cleansing because the water is slowed down. It goes into an area underneath the beaver pond, which is part of the river system called the hyporeic zone, which is an incredibly important area where soil and water mix. And I spent a lot of time talking to river scientists about this and learning about it. But the basic takeaway is, and I put this in the slide, the average beaver pond, particularly out here in the east, might hold 1.1 million gallons of water, but there's at least 3 times as much water underneath being held in a huge invisible sponge that we can't see. So imagine every little beaver pond, woodland pond that you've walked by as having 3 times as much water underneath it. That starts to become a huge body of water being held in the land. And that same sponge that's holding water there for drought, to hydrate the river system, the stream, the brook, the area for drought, is also there as a sponge to catch water if there's a flood event. Because we all know that even a wet sponge holds water. So in this way, it may seem counterintuitive, but by flooding, beavers actually create flood control. So out west, a lot of studies have been showing that this kind of hydrology that beavers create in the river system can be used to mitigate wildfire. And study after study has been showing this, to the extent that California now has a program for putting beavers in the watersheds. This is a statewide program. They're mitigating wildfire, they're shaping wildfire behavior with the use of beaver wetlands. But out in places like Milwaukee, and I write about this in the book, there was a really interesting study where they calculated that if they put beavers in the upper watershed of the Milwaukee River, they could save, within 25 years, which is not that long considering the vast amount of water they would save, 1.7 trillion gallons of water a year. Not save, I mean they could create water storage. That amount of water storage has a dollar value of something like $3 billion. So people are really waking up to the economics. But I had a lot of fun in the book, not just delving into science. I really can become a beaver geek pretty quickly, as you can see. But meeting people, not just river scientists and researchers, wildlife managers, environmental consultants, and fur trappers, but also people in the past, people like Lewis Henry Morgan. So Lewis Henry Morgan was fascinating to me because he was a 19th century industrialist. He was actually a railroad lawyer, and he was from Rochester, New York. He was a fisherman, and he spent a lot of time out in Michigan. And while he was out there, he encountered extraordinary beaver dams. First, they annoyed him because he kept having to get out of his boat and go around them. And then he was fascinated by the constructions. And he would go on to spend 15 years documenting these beaver sites. This is a map from his book. He would go on to publish The American Beaver and His Works and publish it in 1868. It would be the first authoritative account of the American beaver, and it is still cited today. And what is really interesting is that the beaver constructions that he documents, this one that is the plate of the Grass Lake Dam, is in the Upper Marquette area of the Upper Peninsula. And in the book, I actually journey out to try to find some of these places and see if the beaver sites are still there, see if the beaver ponds are still there, if the dams exist. And sure enough, Grass Lake Dam is still there, and beavers are still working on it, which means that over 150 years after this dam was built, there are still beavers on this site, which means that not only do beavers build constructions that are big and strong and impressive, but they endure. And they also work throughout the generations, which is pretty interesting. Another really fun character that I met was Dorothy Richards. She was sort of an unlikely beaver lady, and she earned the moniker Beaver Lady. Sort of, a lot of people called her the crazy beaver lady. But I think she's fascinating for a number of reasons, and I wrote about her quite a bit. So she would go on to found the first beaver sanctuary in the country, and she would dedicate her life to studying beavers. She would get permission from the state in 1938 to actually take 2 kits and raise them in her house. And successive generations of beavers would live with her in her house, and maybe she did get a little carried away. This is her having tea with her favorite beaver, Eager. I think it's a little bit of a joke, but she did dedicate her life to beaver study, and she invited the public in, and she wrote a wonderful book called Beaver Sprite, which I encourage you all to take a look at. She published it in 1983. And what's significant, I think, about Dorothy Richards is that she was an example of a citizen scientist. She was not trained. In her day, her observations about beavers were tolerated and pretty much ignored, if not belittled. And it's interesting now because now with really important researchers like Frans de Waal and other animal behaviorists, a lot of important writing that has come out about animals, we now recognize that animals have an emotional life that we hadn't recognized before. We understand that consciousness is much more complex than we had thought. And we understand that we had looked at the natural world and at animals with a kind of subjective bias that was limiting our vision in a lot of ways and preventing us from understanding quite a number of things fully. And Dorothy Richards made observations about beavers that are now being upheld. So, for example, Nibby the rescue beaver over there, who holds up her beloved plastic ball, was a kind of social media sensation this past year. The Chelmsford Wildlife Rehabilitation Center took her in and has been raising her. And what was interesting about Nibby, they're raising Nibby in order to release her into the wild. but they did give her some things to stimulate her and keep her occupied, and she was not at all interested in sticks, but she loved this plastic ball, to the extent that they were worried that she was never going to grow up to become a beaver. Finally, at about 1.5 years, she began to work with sticks and build dams, and everyone was really thrilled. But what was interesting was that she would separate sticks and toys, and if her handlers tried to put her beloved ball or other toys with her sticks, she would get very angry and very upset and scold her handlers. And she also had a real sense of humor. She would play tricks on her handlers, she would put her toys in funny places, and the point is, she was manifesting and illustrating behaviors that were much more complex than just, here's a stick, I'm gonna chew it, grab it, drop it, put it in a dam, which is pretty much the way people were thinking about beavers, that they were just going by instinct. She was making much more nuanced decisions about what she was doing, and that's exactly what Dorothy Richards had been observing. So I just wanted to, point that out, because I think there's a really important role for the citizen scientists to play today, maybe more than ever. But we can't leave the topic of beavers without talking a little bit about the fur trade. So John Jacob Astor was America's first multimillionaire, and his company, the American Fur Company, was based on beaver pelts. That's how he got his start. He would move on to real estate and other things and leave beavers behind, largely because by 1811, they were so overtrapped, they were an overexploited resource. And he didn't care, because by then, as you see in his map of his global trade scheme, he had set up pretty much an extraordinary global trade scheme based on the fur trade, and he just began to trade other things. But I think it's important to think back about the beaver hat for a minute. When I started writing Beaverland, I had no idea really what a beaver felt hat was. I kind of thought it was Daniel Boone, but it's not. That's a raccoon hat. To think about the beaver felt hat, you have to think about George Washington and the tricorn hat. You have to think about Mr. Darcy in London with his top hat. Everybody needed a beaver felt hat because it was basically warm and durable and waterproof. It was the Gore-Tex of its day. It was so valuable that the Hudson's Bay Company that came here first and set up the first trading company in Canada established beaver pelts as the first currency of this continent. And literally the first tokens, the first coins, were based on beaver pelts. So these are examples of beaver tokens. And there's a picture of Astor looking very pleased with himself and his fortune. There's actually a new book about Astor out. So moving along, however, back when John Jacob Astor was making his fortune, beavers were already near extinction in many parts of America. And we didn't realize then how valuable their role was in maintaining environmental equilibrium. But efforts to bring them back began in Connecticut in 1914 as part of a larger national program to restore wildlife to the American landscape. And it's really a wonderful aspect of our American conservation history that we should all embrace. Some of the programs to bring beavers back, I write about this in the book, got pretty zany, like the program in Idaho in 1948, they dropped beavers by parachute in boxes. So people were pretty determined to bring beavers back. But I think no one has put a dollar value yet on biodiversity, but when they do, it's going to be astronomical, the value that beaver wetlands bring. Because if we look at this slide, you can see this is a beaver-altered wetland in Wyoming, and you can see the amount of water that is now connecting land and water together just in what was previous to this a narrow creek, a thread of creek. Now it just looks almost like a meadow of water. In fact, river scientists are now talking about rivers as flowing meadows rather than channels. But the literal water of a beaver pond contains 15 times more plankton and microbial life than other kinds of wetlands. And if you work up from there, then a beaver pond has 30% more species just across the board. And that is a huge gain. We really should start thinking about beaver wetlands, those swamps that we've historically denigrated as our coral reefs, and really value them that way. I like to show this slide quickly of a beaver damming complex in Montana so that you can see the amount of complexity beavers create. This is a creek in Montana, and this is images taken by Dr. Jordan Kennedy, and I write about her in the book. This is where she was raised in the Blackfeet territory, and this is what beavers have created in just one summer, because they can only build their damming complexes and their canals in the summer, because every spring they get washed out again. So where are we now? Today, there are we estimate 10 to 15 million beaver left in the landscape. Once there were 60 to 400 million. This image from Colorado is, I think, a wonderful image of what Beaverland still looks like today when we let it happen. This is actually a burn scar. So this is an image of a Colorado after one of the great wildfires that happened a few years ago. So after the fire, researchers went in and they identified that where there were beavers living, very quickly there was green refugia. And not only did the animals survive, but in many places, firefighters used the refugia as places to stay safe as well. But you can see the incredible power of this water and this hydrology in the land. Places like Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota, which was established in 1976, they probably have some of the highest densities of beavers in North America today. If you look on this map on the left, that's the actual, every year they count the number of beaver lodges in the park, and all those dots are beaver lodges. And if you look on the right, it's pretty stunning, isn't it? If you look on the right, this is a picture that a friend just sent me from their recent trip. And this is a photograph they took from the plane. So this is an example of beaver river ecology. So you can see all the beaver canals there. This is an area through the park which is connecting one of the lakes to another lake. So the beavers over time have created tremendous connectivity throughout the park of waterways. And it's really incredible. I like to look at this slide and share it because I think this is an example of the closest we have of what kind of Beaverland used to look like throughout the whole continent. But we have Beaverland here as well. Aspetuck Land Trust has some beautiful beaver sites. I was talking to some of the people who are working on your lands, and they shared this great photograph of a lodge in winter, and then Diane Honer there in one of your areas where there's a beautiful dam, and the beavers have moved on, which is exactly what they'll do. They'll come to an area, and they'll work it, and they'll move on. I want to share, in the remaining time we have, very briefly, a story of some beavers that I'm watching where I live right now. And in December, right after Beaverland came out, I went out to check on the beavers that I write about in Rocky Hill, and I was really devastated to see that actually the dam had been breached and the beavers were gone. Because the dam had been breached, the water had gone down, they couldn't get in and out of their lodge anymore, they had to flee. It was December, and in normal circumstances, that would mean that they would really be probably just killed by the cold. But it was a freaky warm winter, and to my great surprise, I discovered the beavers had moved downstream and prevailed. And they started building a new pond just downstream from their old dam and lodge and pond. It was just really incredible. And I started monitoring this. So I call this between the drumlins. The drumlins are glacial escarpments. So this is the new pond that they built in January. That's March, but, whoops, sorry. Oh dear. Okay, so by January, the dam they built was 3 feet high, and they had ponded this much water. By March, it was 5 feet high. And what was incredible about this was that they were still building at a time when there was very little food and very little material. They were just taking down trees like this. And you can see there are no leaves on the trees. Beavers live on aquatic vegetation. So they were surviving only on the little bit of cambium or underlying bark that they could eat, which is not a lot of nutrition. In the wetland there are cattails, so they were probably also eating the cattail tubers because it wasn't such a deep freeze. But still, they were really struggling, and I set up a wildlife camera and figured out that these were the beavers who were there. It was 2 very young beavers. To get them to come to the camera, I actually put out fresh poplar, which is what they're really enjoying there. Turns out it was a male and a female. I sent these images to beaver researchers who helped me ID them. Now watch what she does. She kind of, watch the handwork there. Isn't that amazing? So just incredible dexterity. And then by April, they were really thriving. Here again, see how they've denuded this tree? That's how hungry they were. There still wasn't much food. And they started making a lodge, which was really exciting. And what's interesting is the female was the only one who would be, that's the one in the foreground, in the site that was to be the lodge. I knew it was the female because she had a nick in her tail. The male was always on the outside. And by July, they had moved down and they had built a 3rd dam. And pretty quickly, they had swelled their beaver site into 3 enormous ponds, just extraordinary. And they finally built a lodge, which was really exciting to see. To me, this looks like a little mini Beaverland right here in crowded Connecticut. And I think this happens all throughout the East. We just don't see it because we don't usually get up above and look down. But you can see the tremendous connectivity happening. And what I need to point out is that this was completely dry before. This was an area that just walk through and your sneakers would be clean. And now it's got this much water. So I went back and I looked up aerial photographs from Connecticut of this area, and that star and that arrow is where the beavers built their dam. And if you look up and follow the line up toward 1934, you can see that that is the stream system, but there's no water there. There's no water there because there were no beavers. Beavers were introduced to Connecticut in 1914, and so they just hadn't come over from Union, Connecticut, which is about 8 miles away. This is only 20 years later. They just hadn't migrated yet. So you can see that below the arrow, there is a stream, and it goes down into the stream system below, but not above. What's really interesting when I looked at the photographs, by 1990, there are beavers there for sure. So there's the dam, and above is full of water. And if you keep going up, you see that sort of square pond. That's actually where the beavers I had been watching all those years that I write about in the book had been living. And in 1930, the farmer had built a berm and decided, oh, this is a really nice amount of water, and had been using it. And you can see there's a lot of water that everybody's happy with. And there's a major pond now to the right. Then something happens because the beavers are gone again. Are they trapped? Do they not have enough food? Not sure what happens. But by 2016, there's no more water there. The stream system has actually disappeared. It's hidden. It's actually there under the ground. It's doing what rivers do. It's actually subsurface water, but we can't see it. The farmer has built a berm, so decided to keep the farm pond, but the stream is really only begins below. You can see it below. And the pond to the far right was big enough to remain. So what's interesting about this is Dr. Berkstead, a river scientist who I write about in the book, helped me do some statistics on this and really measure it. And this is the pond area that I watched fill from December through March. We measured this and calculated that it had been filling at 8,300 gallons per day, or 5 gallons a minute. But what's really interesting is that the beavers were pulling up a hidden section of the river system. So they were basically enabling subsurface water to gather and come up from below the ground, which is incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable, because that hyporeaic zone of water that's under the ground is in a tremendously valuable area of transportation and movement of all kinds of life forms and chemicals. So in terms of the beavers' impact on the ecology, scientists are now thinking about beavers in a really different way. The water is just the beginning of what they are actually manipulating and impacting, which I think is really exciting. And I just watched it happen right in my own backyard. When I wrote Beaverland, I didn't really know these things, and I think research about beavers hadn't really known these things, but it just shows how the field is changing and growing. So the site had been looking like this, but sadly in September, and this is the lower dam, just incredibly beautiful. In September, the lower dam blew out. And it's not clear whether the lower dam blew out because these are two young beavers. They had been forced to flee. They'd lost their family. They were probably 2 years old. Were they just so inexperienced they didn't quite know how to build a proper dam? Or was there not enough of the material they needed to build a strong enough dam? Because we have impacted the environment so much that they don't have enough of a heterogeneous forest. So out west, beavers are being supported with BDAs or beaver dam analogs and with a lot of plantings. So I was really thrilled. This is a photograph I took last week. I've been wondering, where are my little beavers? Where are my two little beavers? I've been looking for them since September, looking for signs of them. And just last week, I saw a feeding spot. So what's really interesting, you can see on this picture on the left, they've gone back to chewing on a tree. They didn't take it down. They went to a tree they had taken down several months ago, and they're feeding on it, and they're feeding on cattails. So I know they're there. I was worried that maybe they had died in the flood, or they had just fled. On the cameras, I often see bobcat, I see coyote, I've seen bear. There's a lot of animal life around that pond. There are a lot of challenges for these beavers. But it got me thinking about Jane Goodall's quote, "You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you." And I think about Jane Goodall quite a bit these days because she was an untrained scientist when she started her work, and I think she was chosen by Leakey because she was untrained. I don't know a great deal about her as much as I would like, but I'm learning. But then she went on to become such an important scientist and figure. And I think there's a really important role for people now more than ever to get out there and look and see and work on behalf of the natural world. And at the beginning, when I wrote this book, I used to talk a lot about how the beavers just gave me so much hope. And they do, because the natural world is so resilient. And I think if we look in our own backyards, there's so much to see. And there are so many solutions right there that we have overlooked. Sometimes I think if we overlooked beavers for so long, what else have we overlooked? But I also think recently that hope is no longer as much the important word. I think much more now about responsibility and action. What's the right action to take? So I really want to thank you for having me here tonight. I hope I've gotten you a little bit interested in beavers. Happy to continue the conversation now with questions, and this is my contact information if anybody wants to email me later. If you have a beaver problem, I'm happy to help you either get you to the right person or talk to you about it. Beavers do bring water, and sometimes we don't want it there. So thank you. Why don't I finish here and take some questions?
If anyone has a question for Leila, the microphone is here, so please just make a line and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We also have copies of Beaverland available for sale and signing later as this gentleman comes up to the microphone.
Thanks so much for your talk. 2 questions, actually. Why did they build the dams? And then after they've gone through all that trouble, why did they then leave them?
Oh gosh, that's a really great question. So they build dams because they need water. So they'll move to a stream system. And as I've just discovered myself, they don't always move to running water. They might move to an area of the stream system where they know water is beneath the ground and enable that water to come up, like a section of the stream system where it's just hidden, because streams come up and go back down again. But they need water not just to swim around in and live, because they are pretty awkward on land, but because they need aquatic plants to survive. So we might think about beavers as water farmers. So they need a nice pond full of different kinds of vegetation. So they need a lot of water to grow, to have the food they need. And then why will they leave? That's a really interesting question. So usually it's because they run out of food. But there may be other pressures on them. A lot of times it's human pressure in our day. It can be other kinds of pressure. I think we don't understand the animal nearly as well as we should or we need to. We've studied their dams and we've studied the environmental impacts of the dams, but there needs to be a lot more research on the animal itself. I mean, we know a lot more about charismatic mammals like wolves and lions and other mammals that have really, garnered our attention. We just thought about beavers as like pelts and then pests for a long, long time. So I think we're just entering an era of beaver research. So thank you for that question.
Leila, thank you for that segue. My question is, what are the protections for beavers in our area? Are they a protected species?
Well, yeah, that's a really big topic now. Places like the Beaver Institute have a whole working group on national policy to do with beavers, because if we want beavers in the landscape to prevail, because we are understanding their value, and we want to use them for nature-based restoration projects, we need to support them. So it really varies state to state. In Connecticut, we don't really have any protections for beavers, except that there is if there's a fur trapping season, so fur trappers have to buy a license, they have to, trap within season, they have to, if they want to sell the pelts, they actually have to have them tagged and monitored. So there is some oversight of that. One of the problems in the east is we can't relocate beavers. So say I have a problem beaver in my backyard and it's flooding my septic, and clearly it can't stay there, right? Because I'm not going to move, and my septic's not going to move. So the beaver has to move. I can't live trap that beaver and take it somewhere and release it, say in Aspetuck, where you might want some beavers, because Connecticut state law prohibits that. The only person who can relocate a beaver is a wildlife rehabilitation person, or you can get maybe a special permit, but it's pretty hard to do that. Out west, you can relocate beavers. So Beaver Institute and other places are trying to work on national policies so that there could be better understanding and sort of better policies for beaver management. So it's a really good question. It's one of the questions that needs addressing, I think.
Thank you for all your presentation, and also talking about, it's exciting to hear about the watershed benefits that beavers bring, specifically the hyperbaric zone you were talking about. And I am curious if you can talk to, if someone were to bring up like the fisheries perspective, how a dam can affect the dissolved oxygen in the water and how that'll change the fish species that live there. So kind of how you discuss the trade-offs with someone who's coming from a fisheries perspective.
Yeah, well, that's also a really good question. And it's really regional, and I think it really depends. So out west, where they're working with different types of endangered salmon, they're finding that beavers are incredibly valuable. So where you have more beaver, you have more salmon, it really helps salmonid populations come back. Even though beaver ponds warm water in some areas, they actually create cold water in others. It's actually more complex than just, the traditional thinking had been beaver ponds warm the water, so they must be bad for cold water fish like trout or salmon. But we now know that the story is much more complex than that, because cold water fish, when they're spawning and at different times in their life cycle, they need cold running water, but in other times of their life cycle, they need food, and they need slower water, which is rich in food, which is beaver habitat. So I think the answer is you need variety. And so you can't have only beaver ponds, but you need some beaver ponds. And the challenge we have all over is we don't have a lot of habitat. So how do you balance what balance of beaver wetlands and not beaver wetlands? I think people are trying to work through that, but the really damaging myth about beavers had been that, oh, beavers are bad for fish, and we now know that is just not true. It's not a categorically black and white situation. In fact, beaver wetlands create a lot of food and a lot of habitat for juvenile fish that fish need, but it's about balance. So I think it takes a higher level of education and a higher level of valuing the pluses and minuses than historically has happened. Because I know there's an interesting lawsuit happening in Wisconsin. A group is actually suing the state of Wisconsin that takes out something like 17,000 beaver a year, saying, you know what, you're damaging the watershed. You're just doing this in a knee-jerk way. Because why? You've always done it that way because you think it's better for the fish. All this information is coming forward to say it's actually, that information is out of date. You need to actually update your policies to reflect science. So luckily, I think groups are really taking action. A lot of grassroots groups are really advocating for wildlife management to become more proactive and keep up with the science, which I think is pretty cool.
Thank you. Your presentation was fascinating and eye-opening, so thank you. I have a personal question about the beavers. What is their average lifespan, and how many offspring do they tend to have?
Well, again, like that is such a good question. It's something I've actually been thinking about a lot because when I started researching Beaverland, there were all these incredible Venn diagrams about beaver productivity that was, okay, they're rodents. So you have a beaver colony that has 4 kits, and then 4 kits, 4 times 4 is 16 kits, and then times 4, and suddenly there's like a population explosion, as if there were no pressures on that population like predation or mortality. And we're now seeing that not only do beavers limit the numbers of kits if food goes down, the same way coyotes do, so they'll have fewer kits if there's less food. Beavers the same way, instead of having 4, they'll only have 2. And also seeing that there's a higher mortality rate. So I think it's a changing field, like why are beavers not thriving? There was a big population uptick in the 80s, and everybody thought, okay, that's just gonna go up and up and up, and it's gonna get really scary. We're gonna have beavers living everywhere, you know? But actually it leveled off, and now beaver populations are going down in the east. And so there's now a concern, why are beaver populations not thriving as much? But generally, 12 years in the wild is what I've heard as a life expectancy.
Hi, I can't wait to read the book. These answers might even be in there. The first one, I just would love to know, of 2 questions. Why their teeth are orange. That really just fascinates me a lot, if you know. And the second one, when you were talking about the study that you've done near where you live in Woodstock, you said the dam was breached.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned the fact that there were just 2 beavers working in that area. Would you mind talking about what reason do you think? Was it man-made? Why the dam was breached? And if 2 is a small number, what typically would be the number of beavers? I just found it interesting that you said maybe they moved away because there were only 2 of them. So that's what I was wondering about that. Well, whoops, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the really great questions. So those orange teeth are really, really fascinating. In fact, there's a chainsaw blade modeled on a beaver tooth. They're so incredibly sharp. So the orange is, there's this kind of, the structure of the teeth, I'm not a dentist, but the outside is much stronger than the inside. So the way that they grow, they're incredibly sharp. And it's why beavers have to continually, they actually, when they're resting, they grind their teeth. There's a kind of myth that beavers have to constantly chew down trees to keep their teeth you know, under control. They don't actually do that. They actually self-grind them. But it has to do with the kind of iron and kind of chemical in their teeth. But onto the question that I know more about the dam breach. The dam was actually breached by the landowner, and this is a really interesting story. So he had the dam breached at completely the wrong time of year because he was worried that the water would come over the road. And when I found out what had happened, I was really upset because I knew the implications on the beaver, but I gave him a copy of Beaverland, and I just thanked him for letting me walk on his land, because the book had just come out, right? Then I kind of talked to him later, and he said, you know, he really didn't mean to kill the beavers. He liked the beavers. It was just he didn't really think out the implications of breaching the dam at that time of year. So it's actually, and I appreciate your question, because I think it's really important to remember that people often, you know, not to assume that what their intentions might or might not be. So he had some really some concerns, and we talked about that, and he actually is going to put a pond leveler in when the beavers return back to that site. And it's pretty nice. He's really into the beavers now. I share him footage from the wildlife cameras. So he's like really rooting for the beavers. The reason that there are only 2, there was a healthy lodge. There were, you know, adult parents. I think there were more than 2 I think there were younger kits, and then there were these yearlings that were ready to go off. And what happened to the parents and the younger kits, I don't know. They may have gone somewhere else, or they may have died. I don't know. But the two that I'm tracking, they went downstream. So I think they're just two because they're like refugees. That's where they went. And that's what it was kind of time for them to leave the lodge anyway. But that's, I don't know exactly. But that's why there are only two. Often, 2-year-olds will stay for a while with the family unit. They'll help take care of the kits. And it's not unusual for researchers to find grown-up kits still living with their parents. We don't know why. Maybe they go out and their mate gets killed. Maybe they don't like them after all. They come home. They're like bungee kids, they go out, they come back. But it's interesting, it's a complex social order, and it appears that kits can come back to the home and live there. They're not like out forever, which is interesting. They have a very flexible family order.
Maybe it's the lens through which I'm looking. I work with companies to make great teams. So I'm wondering, are there beaver farms, and could a beaver team be educated and trained and then delivered to some spot to do good in the right places?
Yeah.
What do you think?
What a great idea. Actually, there is, that's happening in Russia. It was kind of stopped by COVID, and now I think by the war in Ukraine, but there was a really interesting project. I had hoped to go write about it and monitor it, but actually there are beavers being raised in a research facility in Russia that the plan is to release them in Mongolia to, bring restoration to rivers there. So it's interesting. An international team of researchers is working on that. But as I say, it was shut down by COVID. There's a lot of interesting beaver restoration work happening in Germany, in Austria, in the UK, throughout Europe. And there was an international team of European researchers ready to go. So yeah, that's actually happening. It's not happening here in North America because our wildlife is considered, it belongs to all of us. So it's complicated to think of raising it.
For the last 6 years, I've walked many mornings in the Carl and Edna Haskins Preserve. And about 1.5 years ago, I was walking past the lower pond, and there was like a heap of reeds and grass and stuff, and then there was a little beaver. And it was there for maybe a week, and then it was gone. So my question is, do you think it would come back, and should it come back, and what could be done to encourage it to come back?
Yeah. Gosh, I hope it comes back. I know that feeling, like you just really want the beaver to come back. Well, a heap of grass and reeds could also be muskrat. So it's interesting because muskrat and beaver are often living side by side. But I think this is one of the questions now. When I identified that these beavers had been forced to flee and were kind of struggling for their life, and it was winter, and it was a real question of whether they would have enough food to survive, I actually called different beaver people, and I called people at different beaver sanctuaries. I actually called the people who are running the Beaver Sprite Sanctuary, Sharon and Owen Brown, who I write about in Beaverland. Really wonderful people who kind of picked up the mantle of Dorothy Richards' work. And they said, get some food out there for them. And I thought, wow, I'm not supposed to feed wildlife. Like, I'm supposed to just let them do their thing. And Sharon was like, what are you talking about? They're like struggling to survive in a situation where humans have already taken away most of their food. You're not throwing them hamburgers. Get them some food. Cut some poplar, get some of the food that normally would be growing there if it was a more natural habitat. So I think we're living in a moment where we need to think less black and white about how we manage situations. I mean, that was sort of a wake-up call for me, because I thought I should just let wildlife be wildlife and leave it alone. So it's interesting. You know, I didn't feed them processed food or corn or anything, but I did spend a lot of time cutting down poplar and taking it to them in January, partly because I wanted to be able to monitor them and check on them every week and see if they were still there. And they would come, they would smell it, and they would come to it so I could get images of them on camera and see that they were still healthy. But I think it also helped them make it through, like the polar vortex we had. We had 2 polar vortexes where it was really, really cold. So if it were winter, I might say cut some poplar, throw it in the water, or you can stick it in the water as if it's a little shrub. But I guess that depends on whether it's your land or the land trust. So figure out what the rules are. Talk to the stewards, they're here. But I do think that the natural world needs more support from us than ever. It's not enough just to say we're going to set it aside, because there are a lot of pressures on it. And even climate change, you know, is impacting things in ways that we're all feeling when we get hot, that, you know, they're feeling it too. So.
Thank you so much, Leila. And on behalf of the Aspetuck Land Trust, let's give her another round of applause. Thank you all for coming out this evening. We do have copies of Beaverland for sale and for signing. And Leila will be sitting right over here to sign your books. And thank you so much for coming out and learning about beavers.